CBDC has been trending this week on Twitter. I'm going to be explaining what it is and why it is even worse than most people think.
When we talk about collective ownership, we are often told that the great thing about it is that everybody will own. The reality of the thing is that nobody but those in power own.
Today on the newscast, the Great Reset, how the push for global government and a digital currency is growing, and why 2030 is such a pivotal year for this sinister agenda. That's coming up.
And these are the things that the world condemned to before. Oh, I said I won't take too much time.
You are welcome to the End Time Truth Television, the channel for the lovers of truth, for the truth of the end time. So if you are a lover of truth, give us a subscription and God bless you. Shalom.
Now, if you have not watched part 1A of this video, I'd like to urge you to please look for it in this channel and watch. This is a sub part of the part 1. I had to stop it where I stopped at part 1 because of the length of the video. I thought it was going to be very short, but then I found out that this cannot be exhausted even in the next 1 month. And so this is part 2. If you've not watched part 1, you won't actually understand in full what we're talking about here. So I'm just going to start it here. Happy viewing and hope to see you in the part 2 proper. God bless you.
What would you say if I told you that by the year 2030, you'll own nothing, have no privacy, and yet you'll be happy? That you'll live in a cashless society where all currency is digital, and that everyone on Earth will require a digital ID to travel freely. And that much like communist China, you'll be given a social credit score that determines how loyal you are to this new global system and those who control it. The endgame is a one-world government. To many, this sounds like something straight out of George Orwell's 1984, but I believe an even better guidepost would be the Book of Revelation and the coming Antichrist-led system. Now, some very powerful global players, led by the World Economic Forum and with the enthusiastic backing of some Western leaders, major corporations, and the UN, are openly promoting this radical transformation of society. They call it the Great Reset. And folks, it's not a conspiracy or a theory when the people behind it are telling you out loud what they intend to do.
So, now, what happens is that, remember, he that has no mark of the beast will neither buy nor sell. I've always made a reference to the fact that when I got BVN in this country, bank verification number, there was nothing like NIN. Then we had what we called National Identity Card. So that was in place. But then they phased that out and introduced National Identification Number. The National Identification Number happens to be what we know as NIN. Now, what is the significance? I went to enroll for BVN and I didn't discuss National Identification Number with the bank, and nobody discussed that with me. I never knew that the day I enrolled for BVN, I was also assigned to an NIN. Now, recently, about 2 or 3 years ago, about 2 or 3 years ago, or 2 years ago, if I'm not making a mistake. Now, the NCC, the National Communication Commission in this country, made it mandatory that everybody who has a mobile phone, phone number, SIM card, whatever, however you want to put it, now must register the SIM number, the SIM card. And so you are required to come with your NIN. Now that threw everybody into frenzy. Everybody began to run helter-skelter. Now because it became mandatory, and so there was rush, and people are still registering today, up to today. Now, but then surprisingly, we were told that you can use a certain code to find out your NIN, code. My dear, I didn't know that my BVN had an NIN. Now, so the mystery there that needed to be sorted out is, why link my bank system with the national identification number it is still the process of unism. You know, this is a platform being built by, by the system around to make the system easier for a smooth takeover by the beast. You may not take this, and you don't have to take my word for it. You've got to read your Bible. The Bible is the final authority. But what I'm telling you now is that why they link this with your bank account is that he that has no number of the beasts may not be able to buy nor sell. And you not being able to buy or sell has everything to do with your power of commerce being withdrawn from you. So when the government of your country feels, or when the supervisor or governor, whatever the Antichrist will use that time to monitor regions, because I'm sure he will have regional, overseers, those that will definitely be in place to oversee certain things that is happening in some regions that will not become country again, Now, they will automatically block you access, just like you saw in that video that Andrew Tate experienced. I don't know if that is that Andrew Tate or Andrew Tate, whichever one. Now, I don't know if he's still, under that experience now, but that is obviously what is going to happen. So what am I trying to say? What I'm trying to say is that the time is here on us. Whether you accept it or not, call it conspiracy theory by Christians, whatever you want to call it anything. You want to get your implants done immediately, as you cannot wait for it to happen, please feel free to do that. Actually, this video is for Christians. This video is for those that are running their life, the rest of their lives. And so, my brothers and sisters, it is a call for us to be ready for what is coming on us. I'd like you to listen to this video.
The Great Reset is an idea put forward by the World Economic Forum to fundamentally restructure the global economy in the wake of COVID-19. But what are some of the dangers inherent in this ideology? Joining me to discuss is Douglas Kruger, who's a speaker and author focusing on political correctness. Douglas, could you tell our viewers, what is this idea of the Great Reset exactly, and what are some of the risks attached to it?
Like many of the politically correct ideas that we hear bandied about in the media, this entire project is couched in kindness. It is presented as something that is being done or being proposed for our good and for the greater good. And that always sets my alarms and sensors going, because that tends to lead to very problematic ideology. In a very quick nutshell, the proposal out of Davos is essentially this: a group of exceptionally powerful individuals, predominantly in the banking, finance, and business sector, in alliance with government leadership, are proposing that as a result of these COVID lockdowns that have done a great deal of damage to economies globally, they perceive that they now have an opportunity to rebuild economies, but to do so in what they believe is a more enlightened fashion. And there are, generally speaking, there are problems with the idea of groups of people in power deciding the history of humanity. In a best case scenario, we are simply supposed to be free to determine our own futures, our own progress, what we want out of life. Now, in this particular case, what they're proposing is a sort of collectivist idea that takes personal ownership out of the equation. The little phrase, and it sounds so innocent, is "you will own nothing and you will be happy." Now, if you go back just several hundred years, the founding father and first president of the United States, which was essentially a project founded on the idea of human liberty and freedom, pretty much for the first time in modern history, George Washington said, "There is no such thing as personal human rights without property ownership." And he said that for several very interesting and important reasons. But the principle is sound. If you are dependent on a greater power for everything, then you are not free. You place yourself as an individual in quite a precarious situation. It was, in fact, the formula for living, the sort of political reality for most of human history. If you look back at a simple setup like the serfs of Europe, this is a group of people who owned nothing and simply contributed to the overlord who determined what they could and could not have. And they had zero rights. It is the property that you own that actually ensures your rights to a great degree. So while this may sound like a very enlightened idea, sort of a communal, collectivist utopia, there are many problems with this once you start thinking about how it might actually be implemented. And that's what concerns me.
So Douglas, is there a risk here that we could see an encroachment of state power into the lives of ordinary individuals and essentially a kind of creeping tyranny that takes hold?
Well, economist and historian Dr. Thomas Soule makes a very interesting point about how humans evaluate political systems. And he says we make the terrific mistake of evaluating them based on their kindly sounding intentions before the fact, rather than on their outcomes after the fact. And he proposes the idea that our world, our politics would look very different if we had to judge each thing that politicians and governments try based on the outcomes instead of the intentions. At the intention stage, it is remarkably easy for smooth politicians to stand up and say kindly sounding things. Now, the sorts of things that we're hearing from Davos and from the likes of the proponents of the Great Reset all talk about collectivist and communal living and how nobody will own anything. But now consider for just a second, that is already a fallacy. Someone, somewhere, has to own. And in fact, what happens is if you take ownership out of the hands of a broad-based populace and of many separate entrepreneurs and families and individuals, and you concentrate it into the hands of, say, a few multinational corporations working together with government, well, firstly, that system is by definition fascistic. This idea of an all-powerful government and the businesses that work in conjunction with them. It leads very quickly to cronyism, to the types of corruption that we see, particularly in South Africa, where we are so keen on talking about business and government collaborating. And doesn't that just sound like such a good thing, business and government collaborating? What happens there is you have the people who own the rules, enforce right and wrong, and have a financial incentive to be corrupt, working with the people who have the money and have an incentive to corrupt them. It's a dreadful formula just to begin with. However, what concerns me is perhaps on a bigger scale than that. When we talk about collective ownership, we are often told that the great thing about it is that everybody will own. The reality of the thing is that nobody but those in power own. And that impulse to take away private property ownership and to concentrate it into the hands of a representative government is purely Marxist. I mean, it is the heart and soul of the Marxist idea, which stripped down to its basics is nobody owns property, it is collectively owned. And as I say, of course, the fallacy there is that it is not actually collectively owned. It is owned by those in power. Now, what can go wrong with that? Well, if we look at modern day China, we get a very good example of this one. Modern day China, of course, a bit of a mixed economy. They have prospered to the degree that they've started permitting free trade. However, they are still very much a Marxist society. And they work according to social credit scores. And social credit scores imposed by law represent a very chilling idea. Now imagine this, for example, you as a family do not own your home, you do not own what is around you, you do not own your business. The government has absolute control because they are the representative of collective ownership. Now imagine a scenario in which you do something that the government does not approve of. You read a book that it doesn't want you to read. You write an essay or an article that it doesn't like. You create a YouTube video commenting on something in a negative way. Now, those are all things that productive human beings do to critique and build and grow their society. But you can't do it there. And if you do something that the government disapproves of, using these social credit scores, they can ghost you. They can effectively lock you out of your world. And it works because you don't own anything. It is that ownership, that broad-based private ownership, that keeps people free from government tyranny. Maggie Thatcher from the UK very famously embarked on a project to expand human liberty in her nation by trying to ensure as much broad-based private and individual ownership of property as possible. In that, she was in agreement with George Washington, who said that it is property rights that prop up human freedom. You can go into great depth and philosophy on this one. You can even take property rights down to the level of your thoughts. Are you free to own them? Are you free to express them? Or is the realm of thinking controlled by a collective? Now, of course, all that sounds, it sounds like terrible fear-mongering. But of course, the question for anyone who looks back over history is to ask, could it happen here? Could it happen again? And I think if you do know your history, the answer is it happens surprisingly easily and it happens surprisingly often. When communities play with this idea of collectivist ownership, I would argue that it happens 100% of the time. And that when we're talking about collective ownership and the elevating of the group over the sanctity of the individual, we are dealing with a formula that has been deeply damaging to the human species.
So Douglas, what about the threats to the property that we already own? Is there a risk there that we might lose our ownership over our existing property?
David, that's an excellent question, and it's one that I think people are not considering. Now, think again of those words. You will own nothing and you will be happy. It doesn't allow for you will continue to own what your family has bequeathed down the generations. The simple statement, if we are to take them at their word, is you will own nothing and you will be happy. Now, that poses some fascinating problems in terms of what communities already own. We largely around the world, we own our homes. We bequeath heirlooms, family heirlooms to the next generation. You might own a wedding ring. You might own things that you want to give on to your children. And I would argue that that is one of the very best things that we do. Each generation tries to uplift the next generation. This philosophy seems to be saying, instead of doing that, we reset each generation at zero and leave you dependent on a government welfare system. Now, from the most basic human perspective, that strikes me as deeply unhealthy. If the best thing we do is to raise up our children and help them to go further than us, then starting at zero with government dependency every generation, it strikes me as a bit of a chilling idea. If you look at basic stats, human stats, around groups of people living on welfare, you will find that you have disproportionate rates of marital breakup, of family breakup, of alcohol and drug abuse, and of interpersonal violence. The stats are way different to people who are self-sufficient, self-sustaining, employed or running their own businesses. So one of the things that I think people are not considering here is under a paradigm in which nobody owns anything, we all become a group of people living under the welfare state. And it seems to me that that is a very good way to do damage to the health and to the psyche of human beings. We don't seem to prosper under such conditions. I concede very readily that we have to help the poor and the struggling among us. That is a Christian, a Judeo-Christian principle. It has been built into Western classical thinking for a very long time. But a welfare state in which you don't do anything, but you live dependent on the government, seems to cause human beings to rot. I don't think it's a healthy scenario. We're proposing it on a global scale.
All right. Thank you very much. And stay blessed. Now, this is part 1. I'll be seeing you in other videos as I watch the reaction to this. Part 2 will come if there is an acceptance of this. I want to plead with you to please like the video, share the link, and put down your comments in the comment section. I'll be seeing you in the next video. Till then, God bless you. From me to you, Shalom.